So in this talk, I approached the question of the medieval turn to Ethiopia from the perspective of a Byzantinist. The title of my talk is, Where does Byzantium fit in the turn to Ethiopia in medieval studies? I highlight Byzantine studies here to suggest that some narratives might fall into the cracks when we have these disciplinary discussions. But I could easily say, where does Africa fit in the turn? Or even where does Nile Valley studies fit in the turn? And do they fit? I will present two short case studies that addresses the topic on the turn and what is lost and what is gained. First, I focus on what is gained by the turn to Ethiopian medieval studies. Here, I review a few Byzantine exhibitions that included Ethiopian art and discuss how these exhibitions brought Ethiopian art to new audiences. I then discuss what might be lost, such as narratives that are potentially buried by other stories, the retellings of histories that privilege direct context between Ethiopians and the centers of the medieval and Byzantine worlds. As an example, I focus on the connections between Coptic Egyptian art and Ethiopian art. And I ask, how can curators and art historians responsibly tell stories that do not fit neatly within the fields of medieval art or Byzantine art? And in these case studies, I will be a bit self-reflective, and I hope others will also examine how their own training or intellectual trajectories might add to or take away from the field of Ethiopian studies. But first, I want us to go back to the 1990s, right after the groundbreaking African Zion exhibition toured the United States. It opened in 1993 at the Walters Gallery Museum in Baltimore. By the way, our colleague Christine Shaka is now organizing a spectacular exhibition about Ethiopian art that will open at the Walters in a few years. But according to the catalog, African Zion started at the Walters and then traveled to the Schomburg in New York City, went to the Menil Collection in Houston, and then went to African American focus museums in Dallas, Chicago, Virginia, and LA, and then ended up at the Cleveland Museum of Art in 1996. And as a Byzantinist, Professor Thelma K. Thomas wrote in her review of the catalog, African Zion increased public visibility of historic Ethiopia after years of restricted access to its monuments, museums, and libraries due to dire political difficulties. And of the catalog, Professor Thomas remarked that, quote, this is a story for Western eyes, not familiar with ancient Christian churches of the Near East and Africa. The art historian Malin Heidman was the primary curator of the exhibition and wrote much of the catalog. Shortly after the exhibition, she published a focus book on Ethiopian icons titled The Marian Icons of the Painter Physeon. In his 1996 review of the book, the Byzantinist Robert Nelson begins by considering the backgrounds of the various potential readers of this book on Ethiopian art. He notes that some readers might come from the perspective of considering Ethiopian art as exotic or primitive due to its, quote, flat two-dimensional figures clothed in strong colors, especially deep blues, fire engine reds, garish yellows. And he goes on to say, some might be accustomed to reading about Ethiopian painting and the studies of early medieval art. Ethiopian miniatures have been accepted as faithful copies of early Christian models. He goes on to say that still others may be inclined to view Ethiopian art in the context of African studies or to include it within a movement that, for better or worse, has been termed Afrocentrism. Professor Thomas and Professor Nelson's assessments were particularly perceptive and relates to the topic at hand today. After African Zion, several important exhibitions assisted in incorporating Ethiopian art into the field of Byzantine art history. And here I turn to my first case study on what is gained with the medieval turn to Ethiopia. In the exhibition catalog of the 1997 exhibition Gloria Byzantium, that was curated by Helen Evans, Professor Thelma K. Thomas wrote an essay on Christians in the Islamic East, where she discussed some Ethiopian motifs also known in Byzantine traditions. And she described the compositional formats of Ethiopia's wide-ranging artistic repertoire and the reuse of early Christian canon tables. Then in the 2004 exhibition, Byzantium Faith and Power, also curated by Helen Evans, the Met's 14th century illuminated gospel was featured. And the Byzantine visual quotations found in this manuscript and in Ethiopian illuminated manuscripts in general were highlighted. The Byzantinist Annie Labat described the gospel and said, quote, Ethiopian painters adapted and transformed Byzantine sources to create a distinctive style characterized by vibrant color and bold graphic design, end quote. And also, Meseret Al-Jara, a fellow in the medieval department at the Met, is writing an article about this manuscript. And she's getting her PhD in Byzantine art history. And so I'm looking forward to seeing the results of her study on this manuscript. But by including Ethiopian art in these exhibitions, a broad audience was able to engage with the visual culture of Ethiopia. A broad audience meeting from children to scholars. And I mentioned this elsewhere, and I'll repeat it here. But the ripple effects of these efforts can be felt long after an exhibition closes. The exhibition catalogs go on medieval and Byzantine art syllabi. They become incorporated into coursework. They get woven into scholarship. Graduate students in medieval art and Byzantine art write dissertation on these new topics brought to light in those exhibitions. Despite being presented into the exhibitions from a Western perspective, this is one out of the many things that is gained from the recent medieval turn. And these are not anachronistic endeavors. Medieval writers also express the connection between Ethiopia and Byzantium. So a 10th century Arab writer wrote about this connection when he described communities near the border of Nubian kingdoms. And the quote here is relevant as it represents some medieval perceptions of Ethiopia. And Dr. Vince Bantu, a specialist in Christian Africa, pointed me to this quote. And the quote says, some of the Sudan and live nearer to these well-known kingdoms do resort to religious beliefs and practices and law, approaching in this respect the people of these kingdoms, such as the case with the Nuba and Habasha because of their Christians, following the religious tenets of the Rome, so Byzantium. Prior to the rise of Islam, they were in neighborly contact with the Byzantine Empire because of the land of Nuba borders on Egypt, and the Habasha lived on the Sea of Al-Khazum, which is the Red Sea. And of course, there's other direct connections to Byzantium, which this crowd knows well, but some highlights are the Abba-Garima Gospels, which show direct connections to early Byzantine manuscript, the Byzantine proxy wars in the Arabian Peninsula, which made the Byzantine Axiomite Empire strong, reliable allies, and in between, various meddlings in the Christian affairs of North and East Africa by the imperial orthodoxy of New Rome. So now I return to what might be lost. Now I preface this by describing my own perspective. My doctorate is in Byzantine art history, and I wrote a dissertation on Coptic manuscripts. And also I'm co-organizing an exhibition with Dr. Kristen Windmiller-Luna on the topic of Africa and Byzantium. But within my own work, I've been thinking a lot about the implications of presenting North and East African art works within the framework of Byzantine art. By the medieval period, Christian African communities thrived in regions between the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean. And the Arabic history of patriarchs of Alexandria, for example, describes the Sea of Mark in Alexandria as a church encompassing regions on the continent now known as Africa. Compiled by a 10th century Coptic historian, the text presents centuries of history of the Egyptian church through the lens of its patriarchs. So it says, and because his good shepherd, Abba Joseph, took so much care of his sheep and gave his life for them, he appointed many bishops and sent them to all the places under the sea of St. Mark the Evangelist, which include Africa, the 5 cities, Al-Quran, Tripoli, and the land of Egypt, Abyssinia, and Nubia. The literary and visual and material culture of these Christian communities have received increased attention in academic scholarship over the past 20 years. One thing that Dr. Windmiller and Luna and I have been trying to do as we organize our exhibition is to privilege these stories that sometimes fall into disciplinary gaps. For one of my current projects, I'm analyzing the relationship between manuscript illuminations and wall paintings up and down the Nile Valley because Ethiopian and Nubian communities visited and lived in monasteries in Wadi Natron, the Fayum Oasis, and Sohag. I'm interested in understanding the circulations of peoples and shared visual languages. This project is still a work in progress and unpublished. And I think some of the issues I'm addressing in my work applies to the theme of our panel. For example, Ethiopian art before the 15th century at times is described as a tradition derived from Byzantium by way of Coptic Egypt. And many specialists of Coptic art, starting in the 1890s, also wrote important publications about Ethiopian art. And Claire Bosch-Tassé provides a wonderful historiography on this in her chapter on the visual culture of Ethiopia that Samantha Kelly edited. And we know that Ethiopians donated icons to Egyptian monasteries and in some cases helped with the painting programs. And I've been focusing on painting practices in both Ethiopian and Coptic churches because of the stylistic similarities. So on the left, you have a wall painting from an Ethiopian monastery church from the 13th century. And on the right is a 14th century painting at the Red Monastery. Both of them are characterized by unfinished style that's often found in decorated manuscripts. So here's an interlaced cross from a Coptic manuscript. We see these crosses on wall paintings and manuscripts in Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia. And like in many Ethiopian churches, the Red Monastery and Egyptian monasteries have paintings of monumental crosses, ornate roundels, saints on horseback, and holy men. And these adorn the medieval walls. They're executed in color palettes of yellow, black, and red and blue. While the quality and style differ, the composition represent well-organized and sometimes not yet fully understood decorative programs, multiple painting phases from the late antique to medieval periods. A similar context to these paintings appear in apses and votive niches and small chapels in medieval churches across the Mediterranean basin and in Africa. If you're interested in reading more about this monastery, then please read the groundbreaking work of the Byzantinist Dr. Elizabeth Bowman. As I reflect on what might be lost with the medieval turn, I consider the stories of the Ethiopian and Coptic image makers and book producers and the results of the artistic endeavors that circulated in North and East Africa. How do we ensure that these micro-regional stories are not buried under the ones that directly relate to the field of Byzantine and medieval studies, that reflect direct context of the center? This is a difficult question. And at the moment, I do not have a precise answer. But for me, to do this, we have to revise and expand our definition of Byzantine and medieval art. The Byzantinist Dr. Roland Betancourt has worked on this topic and proposes stretching the definitions of our disciplines. I try to do this in my own curatorial work with the permanent collections at the Met and the larger exhibition about Africa and Byzantium. And by the way, Betancourt will be speaking about his work at a virtual talk this afternoon at Temple University. So I'll end now because I'm almost out of time, but I want to go back to Nelson's review of Helpman's work. After describing all the types of people who might be interested in reading the book, he says, quote, "Yet what is fascinating about Marilyn Hellman's book is that she actually writes about and for none of the above, that she gives to this art a historical specificity and cultural context that has long been denied to it. I think if we approach our work in this way, more will be gained than lost in our disciplinary turns." Thank you.